Lin-Manuel Miranda was not the first person to pursue multiracial casting to make a political point. Heather S. Nathans of Tufts University shares the history. On March 5th, 1858, around the first anniversary of the Dred Scott decision and the anniversary of the Boston Massacre, African-American abolitionist William Cooper Nell restaged the massacre via a tableau vivant at Boston's Faneuil Hall. Nell did it to commemorate the Scott decision and to protest the recent ruling by local Boston authorities who refused to declare Crispus Attucks the first victim of the revolution. Nell's restaging of the massacre used all black performers to protest their systematic erasure from the history of the revolution. It also forecast a day when actors of color might rise up and claim their true rights and privileges. Nathans makes a direct connection to Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. The quote continues, quote, "In that, Nell resembles Miranda, who has said that one of the reasons he became a playwright was because there were no parts for him. Both men literally and figuratively wrote themselves into the archive of the repertoire." End quote. But whereas Nell's staging was all about slavery, Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton was not. It was more about Hamilton. And that might be the central question for Hamilton the show. By casting historically white people with actors of color, Miranda has put race front and center of a production about a founder. But as we've explored in our past episodes, the show doesn't entirely avoid race questions, but they're hardly a central point of the plot, and by design, almost no part of character development. What happens when you make race a key feature of the casting, but then you don't take on the central questions of race, including slavery? Does that work? Is it cool to play George Washington with a black man? Or Alexander Hamilton with a Puerto Rican, New Yorican? Does it make the show better or worse? And is it a net step forward for racial progress or not? We will answer that question if we can in today's episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.
I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production and go into a deep dive on the questions that it raises and the answers that it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life. And I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected.
Okay, we're going to get to our bulk of our show in just a sec, but first, of course, some thank yous. This podcast is definitely built around a niche, but a very cool one. This is for people who believe that there is more to musicals than just the show. They want real history and they want the deep backstories. This podcast is for people who are smart in the lingo of my field, cognitively complex, and, probably good looking. I note, however, that list of desirable qualities of listeners of this show doesn't necessarily include rich. And my marketing research, by marketing research, what I mostly do is listening to the complaints of other podcasters. There has been a major shift from advertisers to patrons in the podcast business. It used to be that advertising money was possible to come by, especially if you had a large audience, but now it is almost all the patrons who support it. And I'm sure that if you are a podcast listener, you've heard of patreon.com. I just want to say, though, I am not asking for your money. I've said this before. I'm going to do as long as I can. I'm going to hold off on trying to make this podcast a commercial success by asking for your money, but the show definitely needs to grow and it definitely needs your help. You can help just by listening, but if you could give it a rating or if you could post an episode that you find especially meaningful or that you've enjoyed, take it and just put it on your social media or YouTube or do whatever it is you can do to give it a little bit of a boost. Share it with a friend. That makes a bigger difference than you can imagine. We're getting more than 1,000 downloads of every episode, which is good and very much worthwhile, but we got to keep growing if it's going to be possible to keep this podcast going. I'm dedicated to keep it moving as long as I can, but anything you can do to help, I would very much appreciate. One thing you can also do is go to the back catalog We're in the mid-40s for episodes now. And if you've just picked us up recently and you are enjoying it and you can go back and binge a little bit, that definitely helps the download count and hopefully it will keep you engaged. Okay, another quick announcement is that look for coming quiz format shorter videos on YouTube. There's a lot of content in every one of these episodes that's going to put you at the front of the line in your musical theater trivia, scuba gang. But we're going to start putting some more short-form quiz formats out there just to see if that can help give us a little more traction on the internet. Those should be coming out this summer, the summer of 2026. And then just on two quick personal notes, I think I mentioned last time that I got myself good and sick just before I did the last episode 7 of this Hamilton series. And I have been sick for at least 8 days. So it's been quite a break between the last episode and this one. I'm still fighting it off. I think I can get through this episode. But if my voice is a little hoarse, that is why. And finally, you should know in my show notes that I have abbreviated Lin-Manuel Miranda as LMM. And then I keep referring to him as Manuel Miranda, which almost makes it sound like that's a hyphenated last name. And I don't think that it really is. And the reason that happens is because one of my better friends in the world, an A+ human being and a brilliant Latinx scholar that I encourage you to track down and read if you can, is Luis Manuel Andrade. But whenever I just look at my own abbreviation, LMM, I almost always start by saying Luis Manuel Miranda, which is, of course, not Lin-Manuel Miranda's name. I'm just going to ask you to bear with me on that. I will fix it if I can. But by God, Luis Manuel is just burned in my brain from knowing that guy for a couple decades. And again, like if you are interested in Latinx culture, and if you're listening to Hamilton and you're into Lin-Manuel Miranda, you probably are. It's definitely giving old Luis Andrade a read. And finally, I guess I'll just say this before we get going. A tableau vivant, we referenced that in the opening quote. That's where you recreate an event as like a static 3D representation of something. So it's where the actors are basically like statues, but the stage is dressed out. Like you might take a famous painting and then recreate it on the stage with the actors in 3-dimensional space. There's a thing, and the Pageant of the Masters in Laguna Beach puts one of these things on every year. And it's a big deal. Laguna Beach has got a thriving arts community and they put on these tableau vivants. I'm just mentioning that because that is what happened with the all-black version of the Boston Massacre. And that is still an art form that is alive today. That's sort of a footnote before we really get going, which we're going to do right now. Okay. And we're going to start with a recap as we usually do. Last time on our last episode, the 7th installment on our treatment of Hamilton, we reviewed two things, kind of the history of how the multiracial casting of Hamilton came about and the backstory on that. But also we reviewed the arguments made by people who really do not like the multiracial casting of the Hamilton production. The main arguments are that you are clearly trying to do something with race in the show, but it is still a founders chic narrative. That is, you're focusing on the founders and their acts of heroism. And that also masks neoliberalism, which we've talked about before. And if you're not sure what that term means, just think capitalism. But it goes something like that, like this. Yeah, these guys were great because they were heroic. They crashed the British monarchy and they launched the great U.S. democracy. That is a founders chic narrative, but that leaves out many of the contradictions that are built into democracy and into capitalism. If you're a minority in a democracy, you always face some problems. And if you are, say, a person of color or a woman, the Constitution pretty much either left you out or called you 3/5 of a person, but either way, didn't let you vote. And capitalism has undeniably produced some things that are good, but taken environmental costs. It's also left a lot of people behind, cost a lot of lives. And if you were to look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, well, that also includes some crackdowns on unions in a military way that left a bunch of people dead. And of course, it had sweatshop labor and a whole bunch of abuses of the workers by the privileged class. Now, that's not to say all capitalism is all bad or that we don't like money or that there aren't some progress you can point to, but that's just to say there were contradictions that were built in there. And as long as you're focusing on that founder chic, that you have a way of obscuring the people left out of that narrative. To a lesser extent, the arguments against the multiracial casting of Hamilton say that focus on great men obscures the structural forces of history. Like maybe it was just the case that Britain was never going to be able to keep its empire as big as it did. And that meant that there was inevitably going to be some kind of independent nation in North America, and that the resources there were so enticing that that was probably going to be a successful country. And so focusing on the great men focuses on the individual acts that people did and less on history. There's also a lot of people who think that having actors of color performing as white people, performing the roles that were of historically white people, obscures slavery and the suffering. Maybe it erases those people. And intriguingly, most of it comes from the left. That is, that most of the criticism has come from cultural critics of far left and progressive political ideologies. The conservatives have made some rumbling noises, but if you were to look in the literature, like pull all the articles that really go off on Hamilton and multiracial casting, you're going to find them more in left-wing academic journals than on right-wing media. And a central concern that we talked about last time, let's call that the balancing question. And it goes like this. A good balancing would be something like, in the plus column, what you have done, Lin-Manuel Miranda, has created space for minority races in Broadway and for hip-hop music and for a retelling of history that might suggest that people of color could be included. And in the minus column, you're still telling a heroic founder story. How do those things balance out? That's what a good balanced argument might be. But the way these arguments happen, they sort of skip past the balancing. They go more like this. You told a heroic founder storyline, and that's all that matters. And you don't just ignore the people of color of the time, but your failure to mention them has actively erased them. You made slavery a little bit worse, and you have offended the history of the people who were slaves because you left them out and you have erased them from the history. And you made a big deal about that Alexander Hamilton guy, and he was a slave owner, kind of. But, go back and listen to our episode on Hamilton and slavery. But I think what we have come away from is there are definitely people who are concerned with the multiracial casting. They tend to come from the left. They tend to be concerned that the show leaves out the contradictions, that it buries some of the tensions. Maybe it looks like history was a little more kind to people of color than it really was. Now, they make some good points, but I will say there's not a ton of depth on the balancing question, whether or not the bad points outweigh the good points. Okay. So that's just sort of our quick little 4-minute summary of what we spent more than an hour talking about last time. Let's give Lin-Manuel Miranda his due and ask the question now, what was it that Lin-Manuel Miranda thought that he was doing? What was he hoping to accomplish with that multiracial casting? And then once we have those two things laid out, then we'll start diving into some of the details. Well, the famous quote is that he was wanting to talk about America then through America now. It was very much a commitment to the idea that diversity is a fact, not a goal. And we've talked about this on the podcast a little bit more, but if you're in Southern California, man, diversity isn't something you have to create. There is literally a Chinatown and a little Korea and a little Armenia, and that's just starting. And downtown Santa Ana is, heavily Latinx, right? There is diversity all around you. That is what America is like. There's a lot of immigrants. They're here. They always have been. And America is diverse. It is not now. It probably never was a majority bunch of white people. I mean, certainly not since the turn of the 1900s. And so Lin-Manuel Miranda is just saying, look, America's diverse, and there's a lot of different perspectives now. Let's tell our history from the fact of the diversity that we are living in right now. And remember, Lin-Manuel Miranda did become a playwright, at least in part, because there were no roles for him. He was a Puerto Rican guy, and he went and he's like, look, if you don't get cast in the West Side Story, there's really nothing else that you fit. So he went out to create some theater that had roles for people like him and that embraced that diversity. So that's kind of what he was doing. I'm going to give a quote from McAllister. I'm going to introduce McAllister in a little bit, but I'm just going to pull this quote out of McAllister's article. And this is McAllister quoting Miranda in another interview that was not McAllister's interview, but I believe it to be accurate. And it goes like this, quote, "We're telling the stories of old, dead white men, but we're using actors of color, and that makes the story more immediate and more accessible to a contemporary audience. You don't distance the audience by putting an actor of color in a role that you would think of as default Caucasian. No, you excite people and you draw them in," end quote. So that is what he's trying to do, that there's a huge bunch of people that look like Lin-Manuel Miranda, or at least people of color. And he is saying that that audience gets excited by seeing themselves in these roles, even when it's the role of a historically white person. And what is the point of doing all that? Well, history is told and retold all the time, and it changes. For example, take the history of Rome. The history of Rome, or the stories we tell about Rome today, is not the way that the Romans themselves would have told those stories. There are constant attempts to take Roman stories that date back thousands of years and make them alive and more relevant. There is Spartacus with Kirk Douglas that was directed by Stanley Kubrick. There was the movie Troy with Brad Pitt, less memorable maybe, but still very clear attempt to take an ancient Greek Roman story and put it in, give it contemporary relevance. More memorably, there is Gladiator with Russell Crowe that was directed by Ridley Scott. There is Jason and the Argonauts with the claymation stylings of Harryhausen. The show is fun. It's great still to watch those skeleton sword fighting scenes, and that's not the way the Romans and the Greeks would have told it. Even the Clash of the Titans with Harry Hamlin, I know that's kind of a running joke. I think it's funny, but that show also had Maggie Smith and Sir Laurence Olivier in it. Anyway, I'm going on a little bit, but Romans would stage their stories one way. How they would choose to present it visually, what elements of the plot they would choose to focus on. There's one way Romans and Greeks would have staged and presented those plays, but now we're doing it with like CGI and modern cinematography and claymation. We're also doing it with modern dialects and plot understandings. So someday I'm going to do a podcast on why it is ancient Greeks always have British accents when you see them in the movies, but we're taking our modern way of speaking about something, our modern language, and our modern understanding of what plots are and what they mean, and we're putting those in those new stories. And the idea is that there are lessons from those stories that are relevant now, and the important thing isn't that we are exactly accurate to the Roman stories and the original versions. It's that we are taking whatever it is that's in those stories that transcends the human experience and makes it important to everybody all the time. And that's what we're doing with them in our contemporary retelling of the story. I've talked too much about the Romans. We're here to talk about what Lin-Manuel Miranda is trying to do. Well, he's trying to take the lives of the founders and put them in a modern dialect that is distinctly immigrant and very much street level, and critique the stale 1950s textbook-style presentation of the founder stories by showing that their struggles were kind of a lot like ours, that they had fights with each other, that there were jealousies, and there were romances, and there were infidelities, and there were sex scandals, and there was violence. And that happened to the founders. It wasn't like a great peaceful thing where they all got along. They beat the British, and then we became democracy, and it marched forward. That was born in conflict, and it's a rich, different, complex, contradictory story. And it's not the one that you probably read about in your history class in the year 1955, but it's the one Lin-Manuel Miranda is trying to tell. And I guess part of what he wants to do is that right now there is a lot of backlash against immigrants. I mean, that was true before the Trump administration and people were chanting build the wall. There is a backlash against immigrants, but Lin-Manuel Miranda would like to remind us, we are a nation of immigrants. We always had been. We started with 13 tiny little colonies, and everybody who lived there was an immigrant, and everything else in the rest of the United States was not a place that we held in 1776. We were the immigrants there. And so Lin-Manuel Miranda would say that's changed both how we read history and what choices we make about immigration right now. That's he wants to make that story more alive. Anyway, history will always be an interpretation of past events, and Lin-Manuel Miranda wants a more inclusive interpretation of those events. History isn't just you say what happened. You always have to interpret which events were the important ones and what did they mean and how did they change that and what effect did they have. And Lin-Manuel Miranda says, I think that history mostly just tells it as there were these white guys and they were great and they came up with this terrific idea. And I want to point out that there are lots of other interpretations of those events. So anyway, he has the dual purpose of kind of showing conservative forces that they have over-interpreted the immigration issues, that they have written a history of the United States that makes it seem like immigration is just a bunch of things that have happened recently and that immigrants are outsiders that we should be afraid of. And he says that's not an accurate view of history. That's you one inaccurate interpretation of history, and I'm going to give you another one. And he also wants to convince younger minority people who feel alienated from politics that the issues are relevant to them, that politics today are relevant to them because history is also relevant to them. And if they see themselves in those stories, then they can become more involved, and then that will be a motivating force to help the younger people of today get involved in politics. Okay. So those are the two different approaches. We have the people who do not like the multiracial casting and feel that Lin-Manuel Miranda has failed in his attempt to be more inclusive. And it's usually like you tried to do something good, but not only did you fail, you made things a little bit worse. And there's what Lin-Manuel Miranda was trying to do from the outset. Those are the two things that we want to focus on. Okay, so here's our agenda. We are now going to dive into the details and then come back up for air in about 40 minutes and see what we have by way of conclusion. This one's going to be a long one, but did I mention you were smart? I think I also said you were good looking, but you're definitely smart. You're not afraid of a deep dive, and I'm here to give it to you. Okay, so we will look into the history of shows about Hamilton and shows about slavery. We will talk about the arguments in favor of multiracial casting, since we spent more than an hour talking about the arguments against it last time. We'll talk about the nature of art and history, and finally come to some conclusions. Okay, so our first topic that is going to get the deep dive treatment: the history of Hamilton shows and the history of slavery in theater. And this comes from our friend Heather Nathans. I mentioned of Tufts University. Side note, my daughter applied for it, got accepted to Tufts, and it was one of her final two choices, but not the one she picked. They do, however, have an outstanding elephant statue and a good elephant backstory. If you get a chance to go to the Tufts University, check those two things out. In the meantime, they're top-rate academic institution, and Heather Nathans teaches there. Now, according to Nathans, there are actually 9 dramas between 1802 and 1842 that included Alexander Hamilton. Now, that's notable because remember, in 1804 was when Hamilton and Burr dueled, and Hamilton died. So in that 4-decade period, there are 9 different dramas. That's like a drama every 5 years or so that comes out that has Hamilton in it. Hamilton is not remembered fondly in all of them. In 1857, there is a show called Fashions and Follies of Washington Life. And in that show, it pits Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson, more of an arch nemesis maybe even than Aaron Burr. It includes slave characters who are played by white actors in blackface who kind of linger in bondage to highlight the failures of the new nation. And that's the crux of the plot, but Hamilton and Jefferson are adversaries. Notice this is kind of the same point that the critics are making now, that America was supposed to be based on equality, but it has some inequalities baked into its very first constitution, and probably even the Articles of Confederation. But in the show, it's sort of like, here's Hamilton and Jefferson slugging it out, and here are these people who are slaves who aren't really included in that conversation, but are kind of haunting it because you're trying to fight it, figure out equality, but you don't really come to grips with the slaves. Now, those slaves are white people wearing blackface, or at least that's how they're portrayed on the stage. So it did not age especially well, but the point it's trying to make is basically the same as those current cultural critics. In 1802, there is a satire called the Essex Junto, Junto, probably Junto, looks Latin to me, which is the first plot to depict Hamilton, who is still alive at this point. And he's definitely not only the villain of this play, but also is presented as a would-be assassin of both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. I mean, maybe Hamilton would have killed Jefferson. Like, I guess if you made him his villain, you would have thought about that. But Hamilton and Washington were tight. There's no way you would do that. You would only do that if you're like, I don't care about the facts. I'm just going to make Alexander Hamilton look like the biggest creep that I can, which is what happened in that 1802 play. They also openly called him a bastard Creole, just like he is referenced in the modern day Hamilton. But in the modern day Hamilton, in Lin-Manuel Miranda's production, they say bastard, orphan, son of a whore, and a Scotsman. He's doing it with irony. It's like, yeah, I came from nothing, but look, I'm gonna make something of myself. Don't think of me as this outsider and judge me by my parents. That's done with irony. It is not in this 1802 satire. They're like, that guy is both a ethnic non-white person and his parents were not married. He is a loser. It was specifically done to mark him as a racially different outsider immigrant who's not only dangerous, he wanted to kill George Washington. So early portrayals of Alexander Hamilton were not flattering. And historically, of course, there have been many different theatrical and creative productions that have dealt with slavery. You can probably think of a couple of the famous books that you've been exposed to that did that. And that has always presented a special challenge, especially for non-white authors. It's kind of tough. Former slave turned playwright William Wells Brown said that the challenge was to show what can never be represented about slavery. You're trying to deal with it, but it's almost impossible to show how bad it really was. And so if you're a playwright or a creative person of color trying to put something out that can produce some art that can drive home the points you want to make about slavery, it's almost impossible to do it in a way that is true to how bad it really was. There are other modern attempts to address the question of racism and slavery. There's something called The American Play by Suzanne Lori Parks that has a Black Abraham Lincoln in it. And Robert O'Hare has written Insurrection, Holding History, that sends a modern-day gay Black protagonist back into Nat Turner's uprising. So I just mentioned those as a couple quick examples to point out the obvious, which is that Hamilton is not the first show to deal with questions of race and slavery and America and how that connects to some founders. And just to get a flavor of how it can be handled, here's a quote that comes from Nathan's article, quote, as John Ernest argues in his Liberation historiography, authors of color have often been forced to tell, quote, crooked histories, end quotes, against dominant white narratives that have repeatedly misrepresented and misrepresented their experiences, end quote. So authors of color need to approach a dominant narrative that is largely white, that has misrepresented them. And they usually can't just take that head on. So they write something that's called a crooked history. That is where you bend the narrative and try to make yourself included. Now, one piece of note that you kind of have to talk about if you're going to talk about race and especially Puerto Rican experience is the West Side Story. Now, here I'm going to introduce Gabriel Mayora of Franklin and Marshall College. Gabriel is a professor of English and has a book about New Yorican aesthetics. Now, New Yoricans are people who came from Puerto Rico and now lived in New York. So the people with Puerto Rican heritage live in New York. One term used to refer to them is New Yorican. It was new to me before this research, so I'm defining it for you. Now, the West Side Story, of course, was not written by a Puerto Rican, but by Bernstein, Jerome Robbins, and Sondheim. It has been well received. It is beloved in Broadway, was well received at the time. There's still people who like the show that's got some great memorable tunes in it. It tells the story of Romeo and Juliet, and it is, of course, however, set in New York, where they're not warring factions in Shakespearean times, but different gangs in New York. One of those gangs is the Puerto Rican crew called the Sharks. That show, successful as it was, and as much as it did to raise an awareness about Puerto Ricans living in the United States, it is not aged well if you are a contemporary Puerto Rican. This is what Mayora has to say about it. Quote, Negron Montaner, so this is Mayora quoting Negron Montaner, contends that the West Side Story functions as a Puerto Rican birth of a nation, a show that simultaneously shames Puerto Ricans through its racist implotments and valorizes us by the attachment to an appreciated commodity. Within this context, the West Side Story became the primary channel for defining Puerto Ricans and what it meant to belong, not only highlights the far reach of the Broadway musical, but also points to the show's role in the limited portrayal of Puerto Rican cultural citizenship in the U.S. popular consciousness. That is not a glowing review of how the West Side Story has portrayed Puerto Ricans. Now, if you missed the reference in there, it says that story, the West Side Story, is equivalent to The Birth of the Nation. If you don't know what that is, it was a very early silent film where the KKK saves the nation from minorities. It is racist tripe. And at least in the view of Mayora, West Side Story is not really an improvement on that. What is it like to be a Puerto Rican or a New Yorican? Well, you're a violent ethnic outsider. And most people, especially those who've never been to New York and never met Puerto Ricans, if you were to say, What's it like? Well, in the late 1960s, if you'd heard of Puerto Ricans at all, you'd probably been seeing how they were portrayed in the West Side Story. And that was they were violent, they were tragic, they were outsiders. And the final quote is, quote, "The musical numbers in the West Side Story work to tie this sense of belonging to Puerto Ricans' ability, willingness, and desire to assimilate into American culture," end quote. The most important thing in that show, at least the portrayal of Puerto Ricans in that show, is they got to assimilate. Assimilated to Puerto Ricans who are just like white people, are good ones, and the rest might be violent and are probably dangerous. Okay, so the overall pattern, let's kind of wrap up the history of how Hamilton and outsiders and racial others and the question of slavery, how has that been treated in the history of Broadway? According to Marvin McAllister, who is Associate Professor of African American Studies and English at the University of South Carolina, Columbia, and I am happy to say that department still exists. The University of South Carolina, Columbia still has an African American Studies department, at a time where even places like the University of Texas are frankly wasn't out and caving into the pressure not to ever use the word diversity or talk about inclusion or try to celebrate any culture that is not white. There is still, at the University of South Carolina, Columbia, a Department of African American Studies, and one of their professors, I believe, is still Marvin McAllister. Anyway, McAllister wrote a book that was titled Whiting Up that talks about the special challenges that are faced by authors of color. What Broadway wants, according to McAllister, is diversity, but within conformity. That is, we want you here, but we don't want you to express yourself in your own, what is unique about you and your culture. We want you to be the Puerto Rican person or the Black person that's part of our cast so that we can say we're diverse, even though you're not really getting to express your culture very much. The question is, what are you going to do if you are a person of color and are not really comfortable with either U.S. history or Broadway's treatment of race? That is the historical context into which Lin-Manuel Miranda walked. Well, here are the people who thinks that he made the right choice. The question was, how are you going to treat U.S. history? How are you going to deal with Broadway's treatment of race? How are you going to deal with questions like slavery? And how are you going to present Alexander Hamilton? Well, here are the people who took a look at what Hamilton did and liked it. The first one, there's about 5 different here. I'm going to try to number them as I go, about 5 different arguments here, just to keep us, so we can keep track of the pacing here. The first one is, it is a great thing to do because it transcends questions of race. That is, multiracial casting can transcend. Now, it is always possible to transgress. That is a companion concept. That's where you violate the norms, that we know what is supposed to be the story of the founders, and we're going to transgress. We're going to intentionally violate the rules of the narratives that you expect. Alternatively, you can transcend them. You're not like, we're seeing that norm and we're going out of our way to pick a fight with it. We're like, we are telling a story that goes beyond, that treats your norm as if it does not matter. And Hamilton brilliantly transcends the questions of race, and it especially avoids being polemical. This is from a McAllister quote. "The American musical's primary goal is inclusion, or the appearance of conclusion, which means sacrificing contention for the sake of a unified public motivated to purchase the soundtrack," end quote. So the idea is that you cannot be too confrontational. What Broadway wants is for you to not be confrontational. They want people to buy your soundtrack, but they want some diversity to be there. Well, people bought that Hamilton soundtrack. And so what McAllister thinks that Hamilton and Miranda have done so well is that American institutions transcend color. That is, okay, what is the American story? Well, we want to remember it as that was where equality won. There was a British king who was oppressing everybody, but we fought off that oppression and we achieved liberty. And we also did that in the name of equality. And what I think Lin-Manuel Miranda wants to say, in that fight for justice and equality, that transcends questions of color and race. And it might even be that the drive for equality transcends the founding of the United States. That's kind of the point of it. All right, I am going to go on a side quest here just because it is fascinating to me, the connection between these two shows. Bridgerton. I don't know if you've seen that. If you haven't, give it a shot, man. It'll either suck you in or you'll decide you don't want to have anything to do with it. But it is let's just say it's produced by Shonda Rhimes, the TV goddess of all times, in my humble opinion. When she knows how to take a show, put it on TV, and make it run for a long time. And her hits include Grey's Anatomy and Private Practice and a bunch of others. And she is now producing Bridgerton. Well, Bridgerton is a romance set in the 1800s. That's called the Regency era. And it's set in England. So think it's kind of a bunch of lots of gossip, lots of court intrigue, period costumes, people talking in kind of British accents and kind of, lots of passive verbs there. It is, however, the culture that they have created, like the setup for the show, is just steeped with hierarchy and nobility and a queen who's a badass. Like they're all over. If you're born into royal blood, your life is good. And if you're not, then it's bad. And all the royals believe that's the right way. And everybody else kinds of accepts it. The plot of the show generally circulates around the debutante season, like who's going to get married to who and how do the matches work, and the older royalty amuse themselves by trying to get the young people to marry the right people for the right reasons. But it's all about you're marrying somebody either for money or for status or for privilege or within their rank or above their rank, all of that. So there is some hierarchy, right? There's some royal hierarchy. There's the royal hierarchy that we fought an American Revolution to get rid of, and it's kind of just taken for granted. Like, of course, you would want to marry a duke. That's a great thing. But the way it treats race is that it ignores it entirely. Like the setup is just in this fictional time and place that we have set that is vaguely based on the Regency period of England. Everybody has been emancipated and racial equality has been fully obtained. So they just ignore completely questions of race. So you would see things, like there might be a white female character who marries a black male character, or an Asian person falls in love with a white man, or it could be anybody of any race. And that is not of consequence. Are you a archduke? Are you a footman? That matters. That matters a ton. But are you black, white, Asian, Latinx? None of that. None of that makes any difference to the characters in that show. And for me, it kind of worked. You kind of stop seeing race after a while. Like after about the 5th episode, you're not thinking, is that black merchant who wants to marry the Asian female who might be the orphan son of nobility? You see the plots, but you don't even notice the racial part anymore. And we've talked about this quite a bit on the show in the past. We are very hierarchical. We sort people and rank people based on a bunch of things that don't matter, primarily race, gender, and class. And what do you do about that? And you could say, okay, so there's some characteristics that are female. Those are devalued. We could try elevating those, or we could try a bunch of things. But one of the strategies is you just transcend it all. You just make it not relevant. We are taking the category and we are getting rid of that category. Anyway, they did it in Bridgerton. That's definitely happened in Bridgerton. And I think it works in Bridgerton there. It's multiracial casting. Now it's more fictional than historic, which I guess creates a little more space for Bridgerton than there is for Hamilton. But both of them, I think, McAllister would say, have transcended race. Right? You're just acting like race doesn't matter at all, or you're trying to imagine a world where race would not constrain people. And then you're playing with that idea. And when it's all done, I do think you have made progress against racial bias as a result of their art. Okay, so the first argument in favor of Hamilton's multiracial casting is it transcends race, and that is an effective artistic strategy for subverting racism. The second thing that people talk about a lot is hip hop, and we're still quoting McAllister here. Anyway, according to McAllister and many others, hip hop is the art form of marginalized people, especially since the 1990s. It's also kind of lost its way, kind of got sucked into materialism. I would not shy from using the phrase neoliberalism here, so that some hip hop has sold out, some has not. Some of it is maybe more a celebration of violence. Some people think that's too metaphorical, but whatever else it is, and no matter how good or bad it is definitely the sound of the street, and it is the sound of marginalized people, and it was not the sound of Broadway. But it is the right forum to bring the narrative, and especially the founder's narrative, into contemporary relevance. As both McAllister and Lin-Manuel Miranda talks about, quote, Hamilton reminds us that the American Revolution was a writer's revolution, that the founders created the nation one paragraph at a time, end quote. That the use of hip hop in the show is a way of saying the hip hop artists of their time were people like Alexander Hamilton, that you were shaping culture and winning hearts and minds, and you were doing so with your words and with a lot of words coming out really fast. That is the art form of hip hop, and that is similar to what was going on in the American Revolution. Let's just remember, Alexander Hamilton did some important stuff, and if you were to, at the end of the show, ask what that was, well, man, at the end of the show, he fought a boy. You knew that he worked with Washington. You knew that he was a good soldier, but the number one thing that he did with his life was the Federalist Papers. He made arguments in favor of the federal Constitution, and they won public opinion, and that we have a Constitution, and we largely have America today because of those Federalist Papers that are still quoted by the Supreme Court today. Hamilton was a warrior with his words as much as anything else, and for McAllister and Lin-Manuel Miranda, that is a connection to hip hop. It's showing that young people today, hey, that art form that you are so in tune with has got a lot to do with the thoughts and the things that were going on with the founders. Don't think of them just as dead white men. Think of them as immigrants who are using words to fight oppression. And what Hamilton does is it creates for hip hop on its own terms, right? It's not just add performers of color and stir. Like, we're going to do HMS Pinafore, but we're going to put a couple black performers in it, and they're going to sing the same songs. This is like, we are going to do musical theater, and we're going to do it on Broadway, but we're not just going to make it sound like a Broadway show. We're going to make it a hip hop show. We are not changing who we are to fit Broadway. We are making Broadway change to fit us. And that's the whole kind of cultural mix. And so there is the question of multiracial casting, and this isn't quite directly relevant to that, but what I think McAllister and Miranda are both saying is, okay, we are not just taking actors of color and having them play white figures. We are taking hip hop culture, street culture, the culture of ethnic youth, and we're making that part of the Broadway canon. That's to challenge Broadway, but it's also to challenge the traditional way that we think of founders. And so one argument you would make in favor of that multiracial casting and why it's a net advance for the cause of racial equality is that you are creating space on the own terms for people who had been marginalized. Okay, the third thought is that let's just say there is a big push and pull between the question of, are you reclaiming a narrative that wasn't yours, or are you erasing people of color by not talking about how bad it was? And essentially, the issue is, are you making it look better than it really was? Like, did it suck to be a person of color in the revolutionary time? And does portraying all the people of privilege as people of color obscure that? Or alternatively, you're kind of making it seem like it's better than what it would have been. It actually was. Or are you reclaiming that story and saying, hey, that's not just the story of the rich white guys, that we are going to point out that fact that there was racism, but dividing people up and giving them privilege and education and status based on their race is stupid. And those people could just as easily have been black if only we weren't so stupid to exclude people on the basis of race. Okay, well, I think the whole point is obviously to flip it. And I think the critics are kind of missing the point on this. Like, nobody is going to think that George Washington was really black when they see a performer of color perform his role. Here's what McAllister has to say, quote, America's very real racial hierarchy is figuratively flipped. Instead of elite white founding fathers pulling off this great revolution, black and brown bodies traditionally located at the bottom are now banging their chests and claiming the victory, end quote. This is definitely an aspirational history. It is a reminder that it could have been better, that the race of the heroes who led that revolution was arbitrary. It shows an America that could have been built on equality for all, where race didn't preclude anyone from being George Washington. I think what Miranda is trying to do is show an aspirational interpretation of history. He's not saying this is literally what happened or that things were great for people of color back then. He is trying to say, this is what we should aspire to, a world where this history was possible. And so to say, well, you didn't show it as bad as it was, I think almost misses the point. It's like, yeah, I wasn't trying to. I am stuck in that space where you can never put into words how terrible slavery was. I'm just trying to do something that would promote racial equality. And I think this aspirational retelling of history does that. And for you to say, oh, well, you didn't show it as bad as it was, I wasn't trying to. And so let's talk about whether or not it worked, not whether or not it was, in fact, as realistic as it should have been. Okay, so that's the third argument. The fourth one is, in particular, the show resonates with the marginalized. If you want to know, did this show empower people? Do people see positives there? Do people see this as doing something to challenge racism or entrenches racism? Well, one thing you could do is look at the people who are, in fact, the victims of racism, young people of color, and see what they think. Now, according to Stuart McManus of the Stavanovich Institute on the Formation of Knowledge, that's in Chicago, by the way, here's what Stuart McManus has to say, quote, "The Latinx reader is immediately struck by Hamilton's Caribbean origins. Hamilton thus combines two key elements of the Latinx experience, origins in Latin America or the Caribbean, in this case, an allegorical Puerto Rico, and an awareness of pervasive injustice," end quote. Okay, and let's remember that Lin-Manuel Miranda very much wants to draw in that audience and make them participate. He wants them to see relevance to those stories. And by picking this character and focusing on Hamilton's origins, which a bunch of them probably didn't know about, according to McManus, the audience connects to that character. They see themselves in Alexander Hamilton in a way they didn't before. A point that McManus makes is that American history is Latinx history, both of the indigenous people that already were here and people who are colonized by the Spanish who migrated to North America. But I'll just give you the quote, "Alexander Hamilton does not simply embody hip hop, as Miranda told President Obama at the White House in 2009, but also embodies the Latinx historical experience, and we should celebrate this," end quote. If the concern is that Hamilton erases some people, most notably slaves, is what the critics have pointed to, he's also embodying that Latinx historical experience and saying, look, this history you've been told that they're old white guys and they made the country and you were left out is not true. That the people who made this country included people like Alexander Hamilton, and telling that story takes that whole part of history that is never talked about when the founders are discussed. That is the history of Latinx people in the United States and North America who are left out of that founders narrative. And this takes that founders narrative and it puts that Latinx history right in the center of it. What I think Hamilton wants to do is to remember the parts of Hamilton that celebrate the Latinx immigrant experience, and put that in the show and make a big deal out of them and try to form some connections, rewrite that narrative, relearn that history. Now, this is probably not historically accurate, or at least doesn't include all the relevant parts of Hamilton's life, because Hamilton did a bunch of stuff that was anti-immigrant and very much elitist. But it is a conscious choice by Lin-Manuel Miranda to find the parts of him that are part of that shared Latinx experience and to celebrate them. It's trying to remember a new way. Let's just say that all human beings have stuff they have done well and stuff they've done poorly. Times they've been heroes and times they've been villains. And the traditional narrative tends to celebrate the white guys and the things they did well and stop the story there and ignore the parts of things they did that were bad. Like, how many George Washington stories have you heard that talked about his primary role was that he was a slave owner? That always gets obscured. And I think what Lin-Manuel Miranda is wanting to do is to say, okay, well, most of the history skips the part of Hamilton that focuses on the two things about him that resonate with contemporary Latinx audiences. I'm going to focus on those and I'm going to celebrate them. And there's going to be some stuff I leave out, sure, but the parts that I'm celebrating do broaden that history, make it less exclusionary, less racist. I'm not erasing from history the people of color. I am taking those parts of history and the founders that are relevant to that, and I'm putting them back into the history. Okay. And so I think we are up now to number 5, our fifth argument. There's only going to be 6 here. The fifth argument is that something that is specifically New Yorican, that is people with a cultural connection to Puerto Rico, but who live in New York. And here I'm going to crib mostly from Miura, but what Miura has to say, we'll talk about this more when we get to the life of Lin-Manuel Miranda, but there is a history to Puerto Rico It was a colony of the United States. So just as the United States originally, our 13 colonies, were colonies of Britain, Puerto Rico is officially still a colony of the United States. In 1917, the Jones-Shafroth Act made them U.S. citizens. If you were born in Puerto Rico, if you were a citizen of Puerto Rico, you were a U.S. citizen, but there were limits on voting rights and representation, and it keeps the United States in fairly direct control of the domestic affairs of Puerto Rico, and there's lots of legal complications, but the basic structure is the U.S. is the master country and Puerto Rico is the colony. And like all colonial relationships, the colonizer thinks of themselves as benevolent. So just like the British Empire, when they were destroying the nations of India and Pakistan and what would become Pakistan, thought of themselves as, we just want to help these people. They are so much less advanced than we are. We are benevolently just helping them governing their affairs because they can't govern themselves. That is kind of what always happens when anybody takes over some other place and calls it a colony. But the colonized themselves always feel much different and generally exploited about that. And so how do the way New York people living in New York who migrated from Puerto Rico feel is, quote, the challenge of simultaneously belonging in two cultural spaces, in seeing Puerto Rico as home and the United States as here. End quote. So the Puerto Rican identity or the New Yorican identity is that you're kind of split. You're culturally connected to Puerto Rico. You're kind of technically a U.S. citizen. You're part of the United States. You live in the United States, but you can tell the United States is keeping you at arm's length from being a full participant in their culture. And what you would like is more equality. Okay. To flesh this out a little more, I'm going to read a mouthful of words here, and then we'll try to break them down a little bit more. Here it goes. Quote, artists' transcultural New Yorican aesthetic incorporated Puerto Rican and U.S. cultural practices to interrogate their marginalization within the nation state and reconfigure their liminality as a site of agency, thus reflecting the political potential of cultural expression, end quote. Okay, here's what that means to me. The fact that if you're Puerto Rican, you are neither fully in nor out of the United States. You're never fully just Puerto Rican. Even when you're in Puerto Rico, you're never free from the United States, but you're never fully embraced by it. That's called a liminal space, an in-between space. You're never fully in or fully out. And what Mayora thinks is that is reappropriated by Puerto Rican artists as a creative force, that we're not either in, we're neither out, so we're not like either one. So we're going to be our own thing. We'll use that to generate new art, the New Yorican aesthetic, a new way of being, a new way of looking, a new way of having culture, a new way of having art, a new way of expressing ourselves. And the link to Hamilton is that he was the same way. Hamilton was not, of all the founders, he was the one who was not fully in the United States and not fully in other, but also clearly part of the founding, but also never fully embraced by the power elite. Like Washington was his buddy, but he was never elected to federal office, to any federal office. He won state offices, but couldn't win into the federal level, but kept getting appointed to stuff. And so the New Yorkers who recognize we were neither in nor out see Hamilton is kind of the same way, and linking their experience to his reclaims their identity as powerful, not marginalized. Our liminal identity, our in-between identity, means that we can be creative in a way that others can't. We are not marginalized. Here is one more quote. Instead of writing a musical about the most celebrated founding fathers, Lin-Manuel Miranda chose to focus on the founding father whose legacy can best be understood in terms of failure and shame. End quote. He's not really celebrating. Lin-Manuel Miranda is not really celebrating a tired great white hero narrative. What he's trying to do is to reclaim a vilified figure, somebody who history has remembered as a villain, as significant precisely because he's just like the current Puerto Rican culture. He's neither fully in and never fully out. Now, he was pretty much in, just to kind of push back against this line of thinking. I'm not sure that Lin-Manuel Miranda picked Hamilton because he was a failure. It is certainly not Chernow's thesis that Hamilton was a failure, but it is true. Remember that 1802 play and that 1857 play. Historically, Hamilton was portrayed as a villain. And if you're of the Thomas Jefferson fan club, you still probably don't think very fondly of Alexander Hamilton. And if you're a scholar of Aaron Burr and you find value in him, you are also probably not a big fan of Hamilton. And depending on what you think of Wall Street and how much he had to do with that, you might hate him or love him more or less than you should. But I'm not sure that I can go all the way there with Mayor when they said Hamilton picked him because he was a villain. I think Hamilton picked him because he saw the immigrant, the identity in Hamilton. He wanted to reclaim that. And he saw that in Chernows' book. But no matter else, what else is true? Lin-Manuel Miranda is certainly Puerto Rican. He definitely relates to Alexander Hamilton, and celebrating that helps other marginalized folks connect to what is the center. If you think of politics in terms of they're people of privilege, they're at the center of the culture, and they're marginalized people without privilege, one thing you want to do is to one thing that improves equality, that gets rid of hierarchy, is take people at the margins and connect them to that center. And I think that this narrative and the parts of Hamilton's life that Miranda did focus on and does want to celebrate do something to achieve that. Okay. And our final thing, I believe we are now on number 6. Okay. Final point is that whatever its message, whatever it does, whatever we take that multiracial casting to mean, there is no doubt that the Hamilton story creates commonality, and it does so as a piece of art. This is from Bezmir Shishko, pretty sure I'm pronouncing that correct, of, get this, the Karl Franzens University in Austria. Quote, "The play wins over audiences, white and colored, young and old, rich and low income, because of its ability to eliminate the social distance between them through the shared story of their country's founding." End quote. It is definitely a more inclusive story of the founding of the culture than just the traditional founder chic. This is what Shishko has to say of Lin-Manuel Miranda. Quote, "In Miranda's words, art changes people's minds because it allows us to empathize with people we never empathized with." End quote. You empathize with the characters. That's what gives it life. And that means a successful show is successfully connecting all those disparate groups. That, the people who love that show come out feeling connected to Hamilton, feeling angry at Aaron Burr, feeling sympathy for those characters. And that is what makes the show work. And I will say, everybody agrees that this show is a fantastic piece of art, that it's a good time, that it is entertaining, that it draws the audience in, that it engages you, that it's fun, even though it's got tragic parts. Okay, so if it's successfully done that, how did it do it? It did that by getting you to empathize with the characters, to follow along with a plot, to tap your feet along with music, and that is creating connection. And as Shishko says, that across audiences, it was a way to make it work. Part of that empathy is showing the warts and the failures and making the characters fully human. It is a fully human portrayal of Alexander Hamilton. You are sympathetic to him, but you can see he's sort of hot-headed, and you can see that he kind of hosed his, stepped out on his wife. That wasn't great. If the show is successful, it should both bring marginalized people to see themselves as part of the dominant culture, because they can empathize more with people they just thought of as old white dead guys that they had nothing in common with. And it should help those in the dominant culture to relate to those on the margins more. And this show is just a success. I mean, just the number of people who've seen it, the number of people who love the show, the number of tickets that it sold, that Hamilton for Hamilton thing they had going for a while, where you could show up before the show, and for $10 you would have some of the performers in the show kind of lead like a sing-along, right? It was very pro and involvement of people at the margins trying to do something with Broadway. Broadway has added people of color and stirred and tried to do something about diversity. And I think that Hamilton just kind of flipped all that around. It's like, you can be Hamilton, and you can do a Michael Jackson show, or you can do a version of Wizard of Oz, but you can have an all-black cast as long as it's during the Wizard of Oz. Those are all steps forward. Those are all spaces for performers of color. But Hamilton kind of exploded all that open, to made everything happen more exponentially on a cultural level. And I think that just to say, look, this show has created cultural space at Broadway that wasn't there before. It's connected with tons and tons of people. I do like the way that Shishko puts that: white and colored, old and young, rich and low income, because it eliminates social distance between them. If you've done that, your multiracial casting probably worked. Okay, we are at the conclusion, and we've got a whole bunch of stuff to wrap up. Let's see if we can put some kind of big picture stuff, maybe a couple new thoughts here, and see what we can conclude about the Hamilton show. Okay, There's a couple things about history that everybody knows. Everybody knows that history is not static. Interpretations definitely change over time. Even like in prior episodes, we've talked about, as historians talk, even within professional historians, right? As Hamilton's stock goes up, Jefferson's goes down. As Jefferson becomes more popular amongst professional historians, then Hamilton becomes less important. Now, our interpretations of what happened, new things are discovered. There are new ways of looking at the world in our contemporary way, change how we see events of the past. That prior to, for example, the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, finding out that Thomas Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings would have been understood completely differently if it would have happened in 1910 than if it happened in 2010. Okay, so that's the first thing that everybody knows, that history is always, you take the objective facts you can find, but you're still interpreting them, and it changes over time. People know that history is at least part in interpretation. And the thing everybody else knows is that you can't be fully historically accurate in a drama, that you're not going to take the life of Alexander Hamilton, which of course took almost 50 years to live, and took sure now 800 pages to talk about, and then put everything you're going to need to know about that life in a 2.5-hour drama. That it's just not going to happen. Okay, those are the things that everyone agrees on. Here's what people don't agree about. The question is, how far can you stretch it? George Washington was white. That's a historically accurate fact. Is it an interpretation to say, well, what if he'd have been black? Or let's portray him as a black man. There were not 3 Schuyler sisters. There was 8. Is it okay to say there were only 3? Is it maybe okay to make composite characters? There's not agreement about how far you can stretch those interpretations of history. And there's not agreement about whether or not it should be aspirational. That is, do you want to show a possible past to deconstruct an oppressive present? Or should it be realistic? Should you show how bad it was so that the oppression is not forgotten and that those people are not erased? There's not agreement about that. But either way, okay, for those differing opinions about how far you can stretch the interpretations, whether or not you must be aspirational or realistic, these are questions about meaning, right? What does the show mean? And that, I think, can't be answered like a science question, or at least you might be able to study empirically what happens psychologically to people who watch the show, but that's not what these authors are talking about. They are talking about critical theory, and they are talking about whether or not what the show fundamentally means is you have erased the existence of slavery or downplayed it to the point where those people have been forgotten and you've obscured how bad it was, and that's a problem. Or have you been aspirational to deconstruct racism in our present by showing an alternate possible past? Okay. Now, you're never going to answer those questions about meaning, but as critical thinkers, I think we can still look at the arguments and see who has made a better argument here. And, I think I've more than once mentioned on the show, I was a career debate coach. That's sort of what I default to, right? Okay, there are different points of view and each side has its reasoning. We are critical thinkers. Let's look at those different arguments and see what they have to say. The question is, are you reclaiming history? Is Hamilton, the show, reclaiming a history and making it progressive, or is it erasing history? Is it aspirational, so it's progressive, or is it not realistic enough, and so it's erasing them? Now, I will say, having read all this stuff, that the erase side just tends to declare that the show could be read as erasing problems, and there's no real comparison with a good possible reading. It's like, okay, it can be read to say that slavery wasn't an issue. You didn't talk about slavery. You didn't really mention it. You kind of tap dance around it. If you do anything, you try to make Hamilton look like more of an abolitionist than some people think he was. Okay, but if you've done that, then for the people on you are erasing, you are not realistic enough side of the question. They don't really compare good possible readings. And the side that says what Hamilton, the show, does is to reclaim history side, it's definitely deeper. They tend to anticipate the criticism. Ultimately, the erase side is saying that you are still valorizing the wrong narrative and you're still valorizing the wrong people. And I think the reclaim side that says, no, we're reclaiming history very much understands that nothing here is literal. They're not literally saying that George Washington was black. They're not literally saying that people of color could have been in any position during the Revolutionary period. They're definitely not literally saying that the Revolutionary period was rife with equality for black people. None of that is the literal claim of the show. But figuratively, they are saying that race was arbitrary, that we did only allow white people to be the founders of the country, more or less. And that was bad. That was arbitrary. It should not have been there. And so it's possible to reimagine history in different ways. And the point of Alexander Hamilton's life was not to prove that anyone can pull them up by their own bootstraps and overcome structural oppression if only they work hard enough. That's what the neoliberal people, critics of neoliberal thought, tend to focus on. But that the creation of America has always depended on marginalized people, whether you want to admit it or not. It is fictionalizing specific parts of the founders' hero narrative to deconstruct the parts that the white supremacists take as gospel truth. You know, if you don't believe that, look at the number of former Fox News anchors that are just hell-bent on picking up stories about our white founders and proving that really the founding of the United States was, in fact, just the work of white people. If the white supremacists are saying, look, the founding of the United States, it was the work of just a bunch of old white dudes and that people of color had no part of doing that, then the counter narrative, no, they were always there. They always did. And in fact, some of the best of the founders were, in fact, immigrants and were being disparaged for their immigrant status. If we know that happened in the Revolutionary period, how about we stop disparaging immigrants right now in the year 2026? And I am just not sure that the "you erase troubling history" critics really come to grips with that. That they try to say you are presenting a literal counterfactual, and so you're erasing them. And they never even really acknowledge that it is obviously a metaphor, a figurative statement, not something that is supposed to be understood as a literal truth. And instead of exploring, then, okay, well, if it's not a literal truth, then what is your figurative message? They just sort of discount it. Just say, well, you've erased people, and so end of story. So anyway, for me, I guess I just feel like the people who are defenders of the multiracial casting kind of have a better point there. In the end, I fall in with Lin-Manuel Miranda that one way that you can judge any literary work or piece of art is, does it achieve its purpose? And, you know, you can say, oh, but, you know, and then it gets kind of hard, like, did Adolf Hitler, when writing Mein Kampf, achieve his purpose? Yes, so must be a brilliant piece of rhetoric. And there's probably more to be asked there. So ultimately, I think you do have to look at the empirical evidence and try to figure out, did the artwork, the work of art, accomplish what the author wanted it to do? And was that a worthwhile thing to do? Well, when you look at the empirical evidence, like, what is the outcome of the show Hamilton? I am hard pressed to see a net negative here. Did Hamilton do what he set out to do? Yes, he set out to get young people involved and make young people see themselves as connected to U.S. history. Are they more connected now than they were before? Yes. The articles that I've been reading will say things like, nothing has done more to reinvigorate the consideration of history, the treatment of history, the interest in history than this musical. That Hamilton for Hamilton thing that I talked about earlier got young people interested in it. Did it deconstruct the notion that race mattered, that the founding of this country, that equality itself is a white idea? Yes, it has deconstructed that. It is a bold declaration to the white supremacists that you don't own the founding narrative, and that is no small thing. In 1939, the Nazis held a rally in Madison Square Garden and unfurled a huge picture of George Washington. They were saying, white guys, we are the best, and our guy is George Washington. And across from that, Lin-Manuel Miranda's show is a bold declaration that those lives are not the property of the white supremacists. Here, by God, is a depiction of George Washington as a black man. And I am boldly asserting that you don't get to claim George Washington as part of your white supremacist agenda. He's just as much a part of my musical that is a celebration of immigrants, maybe even to a fault. And for Hamilton, I think at least we can remember him as an immigrant. Was he remembered that way prior to the show? Well, if he was, it certainly wasn't in any positive way in 1802. And in fact, during his life, people talked about Hamilton and the fact that he was an immigrant. It was never to say, and that's why we should listen to this guy. It's always to say, and we obviously shouldn't trust an immigrant. Now, Hamilton himself said some stuff that probably also said that same thing. But remember, what Lin-Manuel Miranda is doing is aspirational here. He is saying, let us celebrate and remember that part of Hamilton that was an immigrant, and that will show that immigrants have always been a part of the founding of the United States. Has the show Hamilton set back racial equality? I don't think that the audience that's from marginalized racial groups comes from the show walks out the doors more alienated, or even more sold on the rags to riches narrative that is what the neoliberal critics are worried about. And I don't think that the white audience is more convinced that slavery was okay. I think the scales all tip in the favor of Lin-Manuel Miranda. I think that if your concern is that the show erases slavery, I don't think people come out of that show thinking slavery was okay. I do think they come out of it feeling more connected. Did William Cooper Nell's all-black Boston Massacre tableau force the issue of black participation in the revolution? I honestly don't know, but I don't see how it could be interpreted as you showed more blacks in the Boston Massacre than there really were and overstated their representation in positions of power, and so you erased real suffering. I don't think that's what that show did. But 150 years later, Lin-Manuel Miranda hit a load of criticism for showing the exact same thing on an even larger scale, that people saw William Cooper Nell's all-black Boston Massacre tableau, but not as many people saw, and was not as prominent as saw the show Hamilton. And it got criticized for essentially the exact same point. Now, I am more sure that Hamilton has impacted the culture than the Boston Massacre tableau did. And for my money, it was in a strongly positive way. Okay. We have now handled race for the last 3 episodes. Concluded that, or at least I have made the argument that Hamilton, the show, probably did a lot to advance racial equality, a lot more to advance discussions and reconsiderations of history than did hurt us. That is kind of the central part of the show. I think it was worth spending 3 episodes talking about it, but the dance partner for race is gender, and that is up next. Next time, we'll take a look at the role that women played in Hamilton, both the life of Alexander and the show. We'll talk about who they were. We'll talk about the backstories that weren't in the show. We'll talk about what they went on to do after the death of Hamilton, which is, of course, when the show ends. And we will get to that tricky question of representation. The Hamilton musical was criticized for portraying race as being too rosy, and we will see that it will be criticized for almost the exact opposite reason in its treatment of gender on our very next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.